So if you saw my last video on this lens, you know that I really love this lens. I only had it for about a week or two, but I took it out again last night and I wanted to share with you some of my experience there and then also answer some of your questions from my last video. One of the questions I got was about the field of view. How much does the field of view change when you apply the fisheye distortion either in the camera or in Olympus workspace? And it changes a little. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put links down below to an image I took with this lens and another image I took with the Panasonic 7-14 at 7mm, and both of them at f4. And then you can apply the defishing in workspace, you know, on your own computer and see for yourself, because sometimes it's hard to tell if you're watching a video, you know, how much difference there is in the field of view. But the other thing about that defishing, the question I got was, does it apply the fisheye correction to the raw file? And the answer is no. Actually, even if you set your camera to do raw only, it's going to create a JPEG file with the fisheye correction applied, but the raw file is still going to have that, you know, distortion. So it doesn't apply directly to the raw file, it applies it only to a JPEG. So that introduces some other quirks I discovered with this lens. One is it's going to be in the workflow, right? Because I wanted to use this lens professionally. I have some jobs this week that I wanted to take it out on. And if I'm not able to shoot in RAW with the fisheye correction, then what I'm going to have to do is convert all of the files, or you know, apply the fisheye correction in Olympus workspace, and then convert all of those files to a TIFF file, and then bring them into Lightroom and Photoshop, which is what I pretty much have to use if I'm doing my professional work. So the fact that the fisheye correction creates a JPEG image. Some of the quirks I discovered, because I went out for a little photo walk last night and did some street photography with this lens, and it was an interesting challenge for me because I'm used to shooting with a 17 or, you know, my 25mm lens for street photography versus an 8mm fisheye. And I put them up on Instagram for you guys to look at, some of them, and I'll put some here. But I ran into a few quirks with this lens as I was out there, not just in terms of composition, but some of the other features that I like to use that are built into our cameras. So what happens is when you apply the fisheye correction in camera on the EM1 Mark II, you lose the ability to use the digital teleconverter. Which is something I wanted to do, because if I use the digital teleconverter, this becomes an effectively close to a 17mm lens, which is what I would, you know, I like shooting in for street photography. The other thing I noticed is you cannot do fisheye correction for video. So the little bit of vlogging that I got done, and unfortunately I clipped a lot of the audio by accident, so I'm not going to be able to share that with you. But the little bit that I did get done, it's all in that fisheye kind of look. It's not done in the camera. So it's something you can correct easily in post-processing. This lens was amazing for vlogging. I just love the field of view that I got. I could hand hold the camera about this far and you could still see the whole environment I was in. And being at f1.8, you know, I was able to shoot in very low light with no problem, especially with that new OM400 log file. The other thing you lose, okay, when you're using the fisheye correction is you lose focus peaking. You can still magnify in on the image, but you're not going to be able to use the focus peaking with the fisheye correction on in the camera. You also cannot do HDR with fisheye correction. You're going to have to do HDR in regular RAW mode with the distortion. High-res mode is also out. That's going to be RAW only without correction. And another interesting thing that I discovered was that live time and live composite are also gone, disabled. You can't get to it when you're using the fisheye correction. So just little quirks. I wouldn't call them deal breakers for this lens because those are the kind of shots you're going to shoot in RAW anyway. You know, just depending on what your workflow is, because what happens is if you're shooting everything in RAW and you want to get that fisheye correction done, you're going to have to do it in Workspace, then export them as TIFF files. So that's why I kind of bring it up, and then bring them into whatever software you normally use for editing your pictures. However, you still have, you know, art filters, which I personally really love those. I'm really liking that new instant film art filter. And you still have control over all the exposures. So when you're shooting RAW, this lens is like any other Olympus Pro lens in the lineup. It's excellent. But if you're applying that fisheye correction, you're going to lose a lot of these features. And there's probably some other ones there that I haven't run into yet, but that's just the sort of the thing that I ran into. However, even though you still have control over all of the exposure, one thing I found, one quirk that I found in my shooting, and in the way I shoot street photography, is I do aperture priority and auto ISO, and on the EM1 it's between 200 and 6400. But I felt like the camera was choosing shutter speeds that were a little bit faster than I would have if I was shooting manually. So to give you an example, if you look at this picture here, the camera chose ISO 4000 at 1/60th of a second. And this is a shot I could have easily done at, say, 1/10th of a second in ISO 800 and would have gotten a much cleaner image or had more dynamic range and, you know, all of the good things that go with a lower ISO shot. So what I have to do going forward the next time I go out, and what you may want to do depending on, you know, your photography style, is, you know, the rule of thumb is double your shutter speed versus your focal length. And because we're on a micro four thirds system, you actually have to do 4 times your shutter speed. So if you're at with a lens angle of 8mm in this case, 4 times this would be 1/32nd of a speed, second shutter speed. And so in which case you would choose 1/30th of a second for your shutter speed versus this focal length of 8mm. Now you can choose slower because, you know, we have image stabilization, everything else going on. But slower than that for street photography, unless you're choosing that creatively to kind of get people blurry in the image, that's a little bit too slow for street photography. Otherwise, everybody's going to be blurry. And like I said, that unless that's a conscious decision or deliberate photo you're trying to take. So that's something that I'm going to do next time I go out.